Welcome. This is Debra Ann Clement, and thank you for joining me for this week's episode of Shortcut to the Soul. So, for this week's episode, I want to talk about retrograde planets. Because you think about it, we hear a lot about planets being retrograde in the heavens. Mercury retrograde is probably, right, the most famous of them all. But as astrologers, we routinely comment, right, whenever Saturn stations retrograde, and then we celebrate when it stations direct. And every time a planet is retrograde, somewhere, babies are being born, right, under this influence. And that retrograde energy, it's imprinted in the horoscope. Well, if you believe, as I do, that the birth chart is in fact that blueprint for the soul's journey here, well, then the retrograde energy is meant to play a role, right, in the soul's earthly experience. Now, a few words about retrograde planets in general. And most of you, I'm sure, already know this, but of course, retrograde means going backwards, and in reality, planets don't move backwards. They're always moving forward. It's just sometimes they appear to be moving backwards, and it's really just an optical illusion. It just appears to be moving backward in the sky. It's from the perspective of the Earth because of the differences in speed. And without getting too much into the technical aspects, let's just say retrograde motion occurs in 3 stages. First, the planet is moving forward, and then it stops, and it stations retrograde. Then it moves backwards, right? It backpedals, we say, through the zodiac until once again it stops, and this time it stations direct, and then again it begins moving forward and sort of, just continues on its way until the next retrograde cycle. Now, it's interesting because when it comes to transiting Mercury retrograde, you'll also read and hear a lot about the pre-Mercury retrograde shadow, and then there's the post-retrograde, right, shadow as well. Well, in truth, every planet that stations retrograde has a shadow period, all right? Every single one. And just to be clear, when we talk about retrograde planets, we're focusing purely on the planets. I'm not talking about Chiron or the lunar nodes or any of the asteroids. And when astrologers talk about planets in astrology, we're not talking about really, usually we're referring to them all, to be honest, including the sun and the moon. But in reality, the sun and the moon aren't planets. They're luminaries. And sometimes you'll hear them referred to as being the lights. So the sun and the moon are never retrograde in a chart. So when I'm talking about natal retrograde planets, I'm talking about Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, and yes, Pluto. So when we think about these retrograde planets, one of the questions sometimes I'm asked is, well, does everyone have retrograde planets in their chart? And the truth is most people do, but no, because there are some people who are born when all of the planets are direct. Now, that doesn't happen that often, and that's usually something else that astrologers write about, like, hey, get moving forward, all the planets are going to be direct, right, for like a couple of weeks. So while some people can be born certainly with all the planets being direct, it is the exception rather than the rule. And is it possible then for someone to be born with every single planet retrograde in the natal chart? Well, that too is rare, it's uncommon, but it certainly is possible because there are these periods of time, and again, astrologers, we all write about those as well, when every planet is retrograde, but it never includes the sun and the moon, because the sun and the moon, right, they're luminaries, and they never are retrograde. Now, let's see what else. Well, there's an astrological, I'm going to say, theory or school of thought that says in a chart, if all of the planets are direct, when it comes to the personality, what you see is what you get. And if 4 or more planets are retrograde, then the individual may be shy or secretive. Honestly, I'm not really, I believe that there's certainly a difference in the energy. I'm really not on board with that because you can have a chart with all of the planets, moving direct. But I've got to say, if, 4 of them or so are in Scorpio or certain placements, what you see still is not necessarily going to be, what you get, because there is that guarded energy, right, to Scorpio. Not picking on the Scorpios here, just using it as an example. And so also something you'll hear about is the station. And because really, is there any significance if you are born on the day that a planet is making a station? So I'm going to say yes, okay, in the sense that when it comes to a station, that energy, because it's much more unstable, but it's also stronger. However, All right. The theory is that stationary natal planets, it functions, could be a little bit of the extreme range of their expression. All right. And I'm going to discuss that in a second. But I do want to make a point before I forget that you have to keep something in mind. Mercury, Venus, even Mars, they station for a day, right? An outer planet can be stationary much, much longer because it moves slowly. And I'm pretty sure I remember reading this somewhere. I think Uranus is typically, when Uranus stations, I believe it's typically stationary for, I think it's a little bit more than 2 weeks. And so when it comes to planets, let's say they're stationed. So what would be that extreme type of range? Well, you look to the nature of the planet. And so if it's Mercury is stationed, in the natal charts, you're born on the day when Mercury is stationed. Well, what does Mercury represent, right? It's the mind, it's communication. And of course, communication is really broad, but it's the mind, it's the intellect. And so in terms of a person born with a Mercury station, something in their life just may be a little bit more, I'm going to say more of an emphasis on communications, on the intellect. It is going to depend, like everything else, right? Not just the sign, the house that it's in, the aspects that it makes, the houses that it rules. And of course, if it's Venus, so Venus, if you have a Venus station, well, what could be the emphasis? Well, quite frankly, it could be on sensual pleasures, indulgence, could be social interaction. It could certainly be romance, it could be finance, but I would be more inclined to go a little bit more on the self-indulgence side with a Venus station. Mars, Mars can be very magnetic, being born with Mars stationing. A sexual type of magnetism, and could also, depending on the aspects, Mars rules anger, right? We say passion, but it's anger, it's ambition, so it may be more pronounced in those areas. And what's up next? Oh, Jupiter. So Jupiter is about expansion, and a Jupiter station can certainly, of course, we say have an emphasis, some issue or not, connected to how one expands. Maybe they expand greatly. It's easier for them. But to be honest with you, because remember, we're just talking about a station, and I'm not differentiating whether station's direct or station's retrograde. But the point is there will be some type of a more significance on the qualities of Jupiter. Might have to do with knowledge. Could have to do with religion or philosophy. That may have a greater, just be more prominent in the individual's life. A Saturn station, well, think about Saturn. It's about perseverance, right? Certainly one of the better qualities. It's self-disciplined. And, another extreme, or I would say, of the energy could have to do with sort of being a little bit, Saturn can be a little bit depressed, right? Let's be honest, a little bit of a fear monger. So those type of issues could be a little bit more prominent in the person's life. And Uranus, Uranus is about freedom, right? It's that drive for personal freedom. And like everything else, of course, it depends on the aspects, but that may be a stronger theme in a person's life who was born with when Uranus was stationing or under a Uranus station. So the freedom and self-determination, really, not, just really following their own rules. That can be just stronger for them than for someone else with a, Uranus in the same sign, same house, even similar aspects, but is not stationed. Let's see. Neptune and Pluto, right? So Neptune is extremely sensitive, right? It's also creative, right? Very, say, spiritual. And so someone who's born under a Neptune station, it may have something to do with healing gifts or spiritual gifts, may be very prominent in their life. On the other hand, the other extreme of Neptune, right? They could be very gullible, a little bit delusional. And last but never least, quite frankly, is Pluto. And think about Pluto. So Pluto's very much, it could be a theme of reinvention in the person's life, because it is a planet of transformation. And that's why Pluto, you can go, in the positive sense, you could really go very high, but of course you can also go very low. So I'm going to say, though, it may be transformational, something about transformation or reinventing something in their life. But again, I'm going to say it will depend very much on the house that it's in, again, the aspects that it makes. So let's get back to retrograde planets. So years ago, back in the day, and certainly when I was starting to learn astrology, retrograde planets, they were considered weak. They were weak. They were debilitated. If you read some of the old texts, they were actually called sinister. And nowadays we don't look at them that way. But let's get real. the fact that the planet doesn't seem to be moving according to like its normal path, its normal schedule, does indicate that there's something, I won't say it's something off, but there's something different. It isn't expressing itself in the usual fashion. So as a general rule, the energy of planets, when a planet is moving forward in direct motion, that energy is flowing outward. And so we say expression and fulfillment we find it's experienced in the external world. When the energy of planets that are retrograde, that energy is flowing inward, right? We say it's turned inward, it's directed inward. So now, where's that expression and fulfillment? Where's it being satisfied? Well, it's not being satisfied from the external world because it's being turned inward, so it has to be fulfilled internally. And yeah, there is quite a big difference there, because think about it, when the energies are flowing outward, I want to kind of say like, the world is your oyster, but there's much more opportunity for fulfillment because there's this variety of situations, circumstances, relationships that you can get involved with and interact with and actually helps us, right, get fulfilled. Frustrated too at times, but also fulfilled. But when it's directed inward, it's internalized. So you have to find that fulfillment, quite frankly, you have to find it on your own and really without a lot of help from the outside world. And so another point is retrograde planets and karma. Is there a connection? Now, it's going to depend on what you believe. Karmic astrologers certainly believe so. I happen, to believe it. And I know some karmic astrologers, I believe they'll say that a retrograde planet represents an unachieved goal from a past life. That's something I remember hearing. Maybe perhaps an unfinished life lesson. Certainly from a karmic standpoint, it makes sense to me. And for my own 2 cents, I feel the personal planets, Mercury, Venus, and Mars, when they're retrograde in the birth chart, I feel as if I'm going to say they're personal lessons. They're sort of customized specifically for your soul's learning experience on this earthly plane. And they're lessons that are going to be critical to your soul's growth, to your soul's evolution. And of course, a lot of people, I just want to say, think about Mercury retrograde, right? Like so many people have that because it's retrograde 3 times a year and sometimes 4. Though it is in a different sign. They're always in different signs, and I just want to mention that. So that also sort of shapes the lesson as well. The sign does have some impact on that. But going back to the personal planets, whether it's Mercury, Venus, or Mars, that's retrograde, in terms of the karmic lessons or the learning, I actually feel they're some of the most difficult lessons because to me, these are lessons that, obviously they're extremely personal and you're learning them on your own. When I think of it in terms of, academia, to me, these are lessons, this is the equivalent of independent study. Okay. You and you alone are responsible for your final grade. The other end of the spectrum, the outer planets, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, to me, again, still represents lessons the soul is here to learn and experience, but it's more as part of the collective consciousness, okay? And so for that reason, I feel we're not always prominently involved on a physical level in these events that are shaping this lesson, all right? But energetically, we are. And it may just be that we share a certain value and we support it with our interests or perhaps our actions. It may just be the thought that we give it. And when I think about Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto and sort of lessons on that collective level, and again, I'm going to say I think of it in terms of academia. And to me, that's the equivalent of sitting in this huge lecture hall where, you know the person to the right of you, you know the person to the left of you. But the truth of the matter is pretty much everybody else in that huge hall, you don't know them. You just don't know them. You're virtually surrounded by strangers. You really don't have any personal connection with them, right? But you're all in the same, I'm going to say lecture hall, taking the same course. So with the outer planets, especially Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, what makes lessons personal to you? It is the house, okay? The house that planet is placed in. And of course, it's always, you can never underestimate the aspects. And then, of course, in the middle, we've got the bridge planets. We have Jupiter and Saturn. And again, they're retrograde in the birth chart. Do I believe they represent, some type of a lesson, a karmic lesson your soul is here to experience? Absolutely. Because of their cycles, they have shorter cycles, right? Jupiter changes signs every year. Saturn's in the sign roughly, 2.5 years? to me, it is more of experiencing a lesson. I'm going to use this loosely and say sort of like a soul group. All right. Because if you look at Jupiter and Saturn in your birth chart and you look at the charts of your friends, your family, your partners, it's very common. It's very common to see those in the charts, that they're in the same sign. And I have to tell you, I've noticed this with Saturn retrograde in particular. I've often seen it present in several generations of a family's chart. So if I think of it in terms of, academia, because I'm on that theme there, to me it's sort of the equivalent of a group project. It's sort of like I don't want to say it's a team effort, but everyone is experiencing, has some interest in, has some role, shall we say. But, I always hated group projects, just throwing that out there. But in any event, the difference is you're all experiencing it. It's just we're experiencing it perhaps in a different way, but basically experience the same type of issue. How we experience it a little bit more personal, what makes it, hey, where is it in the chart? What is the house? What are the aspects? All right. And so to some degree, how well you work. All right. I will say how well you work and play or how well you get along with others. When you're in a group project, everyone has to pitch in. That affects the final grade. And so I will say how effectively you work or learn lessons with other people, react to things, does have an effect on, I'm just going to say, the progress you make with the lesson. So that's how I sort of, in sort of a nutshell, I'm just going to say that's basically how I look at it. But what are the lessons of the retrograde planets, and what are we supposed to learn for those of us who have them? So let us start with, as I say, the most famous retrograde planet of all. Let's start with Mercury retrograde. All right, and Mercury goes retrograde approximately, a couple of weeks, right? 3 weeks, 3 to 4 times a year. Mercury represents what? The intellect, the reasoning ability, communication skills. Now, when it's retrograde, there is a greater sensitivity. The thought process generally tends to be more intuitive, right? Definitely more introspective. And people who have Mercury retrograde very often, it's the way they learn, their style of learning. Very often they tend to more absorb things. Kind of, in some ways it's similar for me anyway. It's not exactly the same. It kind of reminds me a little bit of a Mercury and Pisces in some respect, in the fact that when it comes to schoolwork and being a student, those with Mercury retrograde sometimes have a tough time in school because the academics, it's very left-brained. And Mercury retrograde, quite frankly, the energy to me is a lot more intuitive, creative, a little more right-brained, right? It's be a little more, I guess, succinct. And so when we talk about the learning process and in terms of someone being born with Mercury, I would say with Mercury retrograde, one of the things they've come here to learn, to master, or to figure out, that's a good way, I'm just saying, to figure out, is really how to express themselves. If you've got Mercury retrograde, I do feel that the issue is here, not that you can't express yourself, because it has nothing to do with a lack of intellect. It's more about figuring out how to express yourself, how to convey your ideas, your opinions, your gift of insight, really to the rest of the, I want to call it sort of a left brain world, but to the rest of the world effectively, but without sacrificing anything, without sort of sacrificing any part of, I want to say, your inner vision. And what I have seen, I will say, a lot of people with Mercury retrograde, you do find this, it's common. It's common in the charts of writers, and they do very well with writing. And I think that is one of the ways of, that they do express themselves, and it makes sense to me because even if in your head it can sort of, I want to say, sort of be a jumble, or they feel that you can't express yourself well, if you put it down on paper, even if you just bang it out and you're not worrying about, grammar or anything, you just throw out the ideas. Once you view it on paper, that gives you that little, you're able to analyze it. It gives you some distance, and it's easier to get the message across more effectively because, hey, you can edit it. All right. You can edit it. And though if you're born with Mercury and Virgo, you do have to learn at some point when to stop editing. I'm going to say that for Mercury in Libra as well, because Libra has its own little, perfection issue. But it is very much about trying to, like I say, there's definitely this talent here, but it is about some sort of I'm going to call it a communication snag, but about being able to express it. Now, the other thing I want to say about the Mercury retrograde, because it does go retrograde 3 times a year, and that's why the sign is certainly, it's certainly important, but it's also about trust. And that's what I want to say if you have Mercury retrograde. It really is about trusting those insights. It really is. And in terms of sharing it, I do feel it's one of those things where sort of practice makes perfect. It's not the most comfortable at times, and that's why I think the writing helps putting it out. And it's literally an issue of conveying it or getting it out. Practice, whether it's just repeating the words, saying them out loud, and just getting them to flow. But the paper, the writing, in any sense, even if it comes down to brainstorming with Mercury retrograde, just getting it out on paper it just does a world of good. And I do feel it's because it takes it sort of, it just lends itself to be able to edit it for more. So the rest of us left brain people can actually sort of understand it. Now Venus goes retrograde approximately every 18 months. And it's retrograde for about 40 days or about 6 weeks. And Venus, what does it represent? Attraction, love, values, money. And so if you have Venus retrograde, I mean, quite frankly, you're talking about lessons and really, to me, it's like the most significant life areas. And because all of them are important to one's personal happiness. And Venus is also a very social planet, right? It operates by what? It attracts, right? It's able to attract. So if you're born with Venus retrograde, that ability to attract, it is often restricted. It's often inhibited in some way. Making friends, maintaining friends doesn't always, in fact, it usually does not come easily, especially in childhood. There can be feelings of being socially awkward, feeling out of place. Isolation is a common experience for those born with Venus retrograde. And there's this feeling of, I hate to say, nothing ever works out. I'm always disappointed. But there's this feeling sometimes of being let down or disappointed by friends, and especially in romance. And the problem, or what makes it even more difficult, is because Venus retrograde, so Venus, because it's retrograde, it has this really strong desire, for friendship. It can almost be obsessed at times with finding a romantic partner. Money, that's another challenging area. Very often the person can easily be underpaid. And here's the thing, when you think about it, what else does Venus rule? It rules values, right? And when you think about values, right, that includes our self-esteem. And at the root of issues of being underpaid, I'm just going to say, or having a partner and, not being treated well or settling for less than you deserve, what's at the root of it all, right? It's self-esteem. And so if you're born with Venus retrograde, I'm going to say you probably have a very hard time, certainly until you master the lesson, a hard time asking for what you want. That could be asking for a raise, asking for a favor, something as simple as that. So when Venus is retrograde, one of the things you certainly have come here to figure out is, I'm going to say, yes, what you value. But because Venus is receptive, you came here to learn how to receive. All right. And so if you start with, when it comes to receiving, and if that happens to be your issue, I always say start off with making small requests or asking for small favors. Things, quite frankly, asking for small things and ask them of people that they're going to say yes. Because you need to sort of become accustomed to hearing yes, all right? And as you are able to receive and willingly receive, well, then you'll be able to attract more to you. And eventually, have the life, the love, the feelings of security, that you need. Now, Mars is different energy, right? Approximately every 2 years, Mars is retrograde for about 72 days, I think. It's about 2.5 months. So what does Mars represent? Action, energy, anger, competition, right? It's ego-driven, desire. So it is very much an ego-based planet. It's motivated strongly by self-interest. So when Mars is retrograde, these feelings, and it can be the anger, for example, they can be very bottled up when they're supposed to be externalized. You're supposed to get it out, not supposed to keep it in. So can be an internal battle brewing. And on the rare occasions when it's released, it's usually, quite frankly, it could be in a very dramatic manner, but usually in an exhausting or certainly a counterproductive manner. And so Mars retrograde, if you're born with Mars retrograde, they can very often, these individuals are reluctant to express anger. All right, there tends to be a fear of the negative consequences. So there can be issues, lessons to be learned about being able to stand up for yourselves. Okay, and if they don't, what happens is then they accept less, and so they feel less than they feel they deserve, But again, it is internalized. Mars retrograde can also be very uncomfortable with competition, all right? Except when they're competing with themselves. They can be really good with competing with themselves, but outside competition can be an issue. They can tend to hesitate before acting. So it can lead to, well, what has happened, right? Fortune favors the bold. It can lead to quite frankly, some missed opportunities. With Mars as retrograde, one of the things you are here, by all means, to do is to develop, develop leadership abilities. And, to gain practice in that area, one of the things I feel is helpful for Mars retrograde is to really define goals clearly, not just the goals, but with every step. And they might have to be a million little steps, instead of a whole bunch of giant steps, but with the steps that you plan to achieve them. And you need to establish firm deadlines. All right. In the beginning, like I say, it could be baby steps because you need to be able to see, to get some good feedback. I guess that's the way I'm going to do it. You need to have some little successes along the way, and also to gain confidence. That'll help you develop confidence. And so for you, I'm just going to say, if you're born with Mars retrograde, you might do well to practice, I'm going to say simple, okay, confrontation, or even negotiation techniques, because Mars retrograde, that's a little bit competitive if you're negotiating. And so to help you become comfortable with that, and just, again, some simple things. And also to become comfortable in general just with expressing your feelings, especially anger. So that when you're annoyed, okay, when you're angry, when somebody's pissed you off, instead of bottling it up and just exploding, again, it's confrontation, doing it in a healthy way. And it's about being productive, but standing up for yourself. And so again, small steps, it may not be, anything, again, you don't have to start with anything major. Just maybe start with something, that's a little bit annoying, like, I don't know, hey, can you stop, tapping the pencil? Again, things where you're going to get some cooperation, because it'll help build confidence. Now, let's see, who else? What else, right? So, what I'm going to talk about, let's go to Jupiter. So about every 13 months, I believe Jupiter is retrograde for about 4 months. And Jupiter is the principle of expansion, abundance. It's higher knowledge, and that includes religion, also philosophy. And so I've always said this, Jupiter retrograde, the individual is usually a late bloomer in some area. It's not a late bloomer in the sense of Saturn, okay, because Saturn just in general, right, can be a late bloomer. But with Jupiter retrograde, I always said it's buried treasure. It truly is, and that's really shown by the rest of the chart. But when we're talking about that Jupiter retrograde, the principal expansion, where's the difficulty? It is about expanding, okay, advancing, growing. But there can also be questions. All right. When it comes to Jupiter is also about, I'm going to say, religion and higher knowledge. And so there may also be issues with what I'm going to say is the external world when it comes to moral questions, ethical questions, because a Jupiter retrograde person will usually, they don't accept the standard, whatever the standard you want to call, dogma for lack of a better word. And they do look within for it, but there's a reluctance. There's this reluctance, whatever their insights are, is this reluctance to share it necessarily with society. Why? Because there is this fear. Okay, there tends to be very often a fear of being either ridiculed or a fear of maybe being condemned or persecuted for views, that are considered different. Because remember, we're talking karma here, so it could be something past life experiences. Now, Jupiter retrograde, highly intuitive placement. It is so common in the charts of mediums, clairvoyants, your intuitives, and your healers. All right. Other things as well, but I just see this so often. And so one of the things I feel if you're born with Jupiter retrograde, that really you're here to learn to allow that inner voice, to heed your inner voice, to expand, quite frankly, I feel like on a spiritual level. But when I say spiritual, it's not just necessarily in the intuitive arts. It may be something on healing. And healing, by the way, is not just physical healing. By all means, there's very often talent for that. But it can have healing to do with like psychology or any type of counseling or mentoring, okay? It can just be teaching and knowledge. But I do feel that Jupiter retrograde is here, like I say, to share that inner wisdom, and to learn to be able to share it honestly with other people, okay? Your answers, your own insights. And really it's about being able to remain true to your own beliefs. Now, Saturn. So Saturn Saturn goes retrograde. It's a little bit, about every year, a little bit, give or take, a little bit more. It's also retrograde for, I think, roughly about 121 days. I think I recall it's about 4 months. Now, Saturn deals with karma, responsibility, structure. We say reality, right? Saturn is the reality check. And Saturn is also in the chart where we all tend to feel a little bit less than. So what happens when Saturn is retrograde? Well, Saturn retrograde in the natal chart, Saturn, there's often a need to prove oneself. Well, when it's retrograde, it's like more of a compulsion to prove oneself. And if you're born with Saturn retrograde, you could be driven by insecurity. And that is why a lot of people with Saturn retrograde, they are overachievers. And they're overachievers and they overcompensate. They're seeking approval. All right. And so what happens is, okay, because to me, this is the issue with Saturn retrograde. So one of the lessons, I'm just going to say, so Saturn is about reaping what you sow. And for Saturn retrograde, that's the same lesson. It is about reaping what one sows. Thing is that when Saturn is retrograde, that need to seek, I don't want to say constant approval, but that need to be being this overachiever, right? This overcompensating. It stems because there's this fear of rejection. And the lesson has to come for Saturn retrograde to realize that, wait a minute, hey, the more you overcompensate, okay, the less you achieve. And the reason is because whatever it is that you're overcompensating, whether you're overdoing or you're overgiving, as the case may be, you're really giving it out of insecurity, because you're really trying to overdo it so you can control your circumstances, honestly, because it really comes down to a control issue, because you fear the outcome. So you're kind of like trying to stack the deck by overcompensating. And so what does that come down to? Well, then, hey, you know what? That's not sowing seeds of success. It's actually planting seeds of doubt. So with Saturn retrograde, they have to watch that their own acts. I'm going to say you can actually be your own worst enemy. So Saturn is definitely about accountability. And if you've got Saturn retrograde, it really is very much about accepting. I'm going to say owning, learning certainly from your mistakes. By all means, and that's pretty much a lesson of Saturn anyway. But if you've got the Saturn retrograde, it's about the control. It's about really letting go to some degree of that overcompensating, that control, and realizing the action that I'm going to say you can really be in your own way when it comes to achieving success. And let me see. Oh, Uranus. Goodness. So Uranus. So, all right, about every year, Uranus is retrograde. I think about 5 months, a little bit longer. Uranus, the nonconformist of the zodiac, right, represents the urge for freedom. And yes, it's brilliant and it's rebellious. And, you know, again, outer planets, the house, especially, you know, right, that it occupies will represent those life areas where you want to be different. But if you're born with Uranus retrograde, that desire to be different, shall we say, it's amplified. It's amplified. And usually a desire for freedom in some way or some area of your life usually makes itself known at a pretty young age. And if Uranus retrograde, that need to be different, for all the brilliance, individuals with Uranus retrograde very often find it difficult, certainly when they're younger, to find their place, I'm going to say, you know, in society, so to speak. And part of the reason, to be honest, is because really deep down inside, there's a part of them that really doesn't want to be part of society. You know, they don't want to be that face, I want to say, in the crowd. In fact, they can actually sort of take pride in being on the outside. So what happens? Well, you know, it's fine, but Uranus, if you've got Uranus retrograde, you can end up, if that's the path, you can isolate yourself in some ways. And so very often with Uranus retrograde, let's say the brilliance, right, this brilliance of Uranus, the genius of Uranus, it can actually go unrecognized. Why? Well, you've isolated yourself. And the truth of the matter is that we're all, right, sort of conduits for each other. And so you don't connect with the people that could help you, or the community who might be able to give you the support. And that is ultimately necessary for success. And so if you are born with Uranus retrograde, you know, one of the lessons I have to say is, by all means, you're going to keep your individuality. That's important, and the freedom. But you still need to learn to work, to some degree, to work and play well with others. Now, Neptune. So, Neptune. Neptune is actually Neptune is retrograde about every year, for about 5 months. And Neptune, imagination, right? Spirituality, perfection. It is also illusion, confusion, escapism. It is an ego-denying planet. And Neptune also represents selfless service. Neptune, we say, it dissolves what it touches, right? So, again, much is going to depend on the house placement of your Neptune, of course, and the aspects. But when Neptune is retrograde in the chart, a need sometimes, and I'm going to say sometimes a need for escapism can be triggered. It can just be triggered if there's stress in your life, all right? The need to escape in some way can be easily triggered. But the other side of it, and in that sense, I'm going to say also with stress, Neptune retrograde, depending on the chart, sometimes you can fall prey to believing your own fiction, all right? But the other side of it I want to say is that Neptune is about selfless service. And while that can be a wonderful thing, one of the lessons with Neptune retrograde is when do you stop? Because it can give, right, Neptune, it's perfection and it's wonderful and it's compassion and those are all the great attributes. But it can also give until it's burned out, till there's nothing left. Also, there can be boundary issues, a lack of clarity of when it comes to Neptune issues. And again, depending on where that Neptune falls in your chart. So if it's in the 7th house, it can have to do something certainly with relationships. But if it's in your 2nd house, which actually Neptune in the 2nd house can be fortunate in some ways, but if you're thinking about that ego denying with the money, it may be like, I don't really want to earn money, or, you don't advocate for yourself, or the money just comes and, you just give it all away. And to some point that's fine unless you are sabotaging yourself, right? Which is also Neptune. So one of the lessons I'm just going to say, if Neptune is retrograde, to me it is very much about boundaries. It's not always boundaries with relationships, but to some degree balance and boundaries. And of course it is, also where you feel inspired, and that's a good side of just Neptune. But the retrograde, you do have to watch about going a little bit too extreme, because when it comes even to the service, it may be where you're escaping, all right? And so you're really not dealing with other areas of life because you get into satisfaction. It's like, oh, well, it's great, I'm a good person and I'm serving. So just have to watch that a little. And last, and again, I'm going to say not least, has to do as far as the planets, I have a couple other points then to make, is Pluto. So, Pluto, the orbit is not regular. It spends between 12 and 31 years in a sign. It does go retrograde about every year for about 5+ months. And I think I remember reading somewhere that I think close to half the world's population is born with Pluto retrograde. So Pluto is a planet of transformation, regeneration, right, control. And again, the house is going to mean a lot. But when you're talking about Pluto being retrograde, there's a need with Pluto, all right, regardless of where it falls, where whatever house it's in. Let me just do it this way. It's very often where you tend to feel powerless, or you might feel a little ineffective, but I'm going to say you may feel powerless. And you tend to respond by trying to dominate or manipulate circumstances. And this is just very often just general, side of Pluto in a house. Thing is, when Pluto is retrograde, that need, I want to say, to be to dominate, to control, to be the final authority is intensified. And so it's more likely to be involved in, I want to say, control issues. So if you have Pluto retrograde in the 4th house and it's in your household, you may feel like when you grew up, nobody gave me a voice when I was growing up. And even then maybe you have your own home or you have your own family and you still feel like, my God, my spouse or my kids run the house, the dog runs the house. I don't know if you hear my dog in the background down there, but he's just having a little fun there and playing. So, but that may be the issue. So with Pluto's retrograde, one of the lessons here that they've come here to learn is that when it comes to external factors, the thing is you can't always be the final authority when it comes to external factors, all right? Because that drive for it is going to be really strong. But you are here to learn that you are the final authority when it comes to how you respond or how you react to them. Now, the houses, I do want to say, and I mentioned this already, that of course, the houses that retrograde planets fall in, those are the life areas that are going to be prominent and connected to it. Also, the house that the planet rules. If a retrograde planet is your chart ruler, and by that I mean it rules the 1st house, it rules your ascendant. You've got Gemini rising and you have Mercury retrograde, your chart ruler, is retrograde. what I have seen is that it is not the approach to life. There can be some, I'm going to use the word, some hesitancy, some false steps a little bit. Sometimes there's a little bit of a lack of confidence, and I know I'm repeating myself, but it really means so much to where that planet is, but really what the aspects are going to be. Because if your chart ruler is retrograde, but it is very well supported in your chart, you're not going to experience it as that much of a problem because you're going to have that flow. But if it is the recipient of some very challenging energy, I'm just going to say, let's say you've got Scorpio rising and Pluto is retrograde and Saturn is squaring it. You may experience blocks in your life or feel like, wow, you're always sort of having to knock down a wall. So it is just something to keep in mind if the chart ruler is retrograde. And, like everything else, retrograde planets, like everything else in astrology, doesn't occur in a vacuum. So, again, those aspects, pay attention to them. They're strongly supported. The lesson's going to be easier to learn. There's a lot of challenging aspects, especially squares. Sure, there can be more frustration, but it also means that there are a lot of opportunities for growth. And the growth very often, where's it going to come through? Well, it usually comes through interactions with other people who trigger situations that force us to face the issue, usually annoy us, quite frankly, but that's how it comes. It will also come through transits and progressions, all right, to the chart. Notably, of course, the hard ones, because it's the provocative nature that forces us to act. So with that in mind, you want to pay attention to the aspects, particularly if you have any flowing transits, I should say, especially a trine to a retrograde planet. Note those times, because especially if it's coming from an outer planet, by the way, because outer planet transits last longer, because at that time with that flow of energy, the retrograde planet in your chart, it'll be easier for that energy, for the planets to express themselves more easily because they're getting this supportive energy. So you want to use those periods of time, to work on the lessons that your retrograde planet, quite frankly, requires you, is here to teach you. And so you try to take advantage absolutely of the trines. The sextiles as well, they do take more effort, but it'll still be getting a head start. And so when these challenging transits do arrive, when the squares come, when the oppositions come, and they're triggering, let's say, a lesson for you, it's not going to be quite as difficult. And so let me just see if there's anything else. Well, that just about wraps it up today on retrograde planets. I will say I'm on social media. If you want to follow me, I'll just give that out. It's at astrologer Debra, and it's Debra, Debra. And if you are on Facebook, join my private community. It's a shortcut to the soul community. We'd love to have you. And that's about it. So that wraps it up. So listen, again, thank you so much for joining me. And until next time, may Jupiter's blessings be your constant companion.
We hope you've enjoyed this presentation. To schedule a consultation, please visit DebraClementAstrologer.com.